Sarah Johnson's heels clicked against the sidewalk as she dragged her wheeled suitcase toward her Victorian-style home, exhausted from a week-long business conference in Chicago. The setting sun cast long shadows across her well-maintained front lawn, and all she could think about was sinking into her comfortable couch with a glass of wine. Her peaceful homecoming dreams shattered when she spotted two police cruisers parked haphazardly in front of her house, their red and blue lights silently flashing against the darkening sky. Her heart rate quickened, but she maintained her composure. After all, this was her property, purchased with the fruits of her successful tech consulting business. As Sarah approached her front gate, three officers stood on her porch, one of them knocking forcefully on her door. She noticed Mrs. Henderson, her elderly neighbor, peering anxiously from behind her curtains next door. Something wasn't right. "Excuse me, officers," Sarah called out, her voice clear and professional. "Is there a problem?" Officer Mike Thompson turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving to rest on its holster. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with a clean-shaven face and rigid posture that screamed rookie. His eyes narrowed as they landed on Sarah's designer business suit and expensive luggage. "Ma'am, we've received reports of suspicious activity at this address," he stated firmly. "This is a private residence. I'm going to need you to step back." Sarah felt a familiar knot in her stomach, one she'd experienced too many times before in similar situations. She reached for her purse, moving slowly and deliberately. "Officer, I live here. This is my house. I can show you my ID and property papers." Officer Thompson's partner, an older woman with graying hair, stepped forward with interest, but Thompson raised his hand to stop her. "Ma'am, we've been monitoring this house for the past hour. The owners are away, according to the neighbor's report." Sarah's patience began to wear thin as she pulled out her driver's license and property documents, which she learned to keep handy years ago. "I am the owner. I've been away on business. Mrs. Henderson probably didn't recognize me in my work clothes. We usually chat when I'm gardening on weekends." But Officer Thompson barely glanced at her documents. Instead, his face hardened with unwarranted suspicion. "These could be fake. I'm going to need you to leave the premises until we can verify ownership through proper channels." The absurdity of being denied entry to her own home, a place she'd owned for 5 years, hit Sarah like a physical blow. She noticed her security cameras blinking silently above, recording every moment of this interaction. Taking a deep breath, she reached for her phone, maintaining eye contact with Officer Thompson. "I'll step back," she said calmly, her mind already formulating a plan. "But I'm calling my lawyer right now, and I suggest you take a very good look at those documents in your hand, Officer Thompson." She emphasized his name, which she'd read from his badge, making it clear this incident wouldn't be forgotten. Little did Officer Thompson know that his next 8 minutes of power-tripping would become the catalyst for a series of events that would reshape department policies and community relations throughout the entire city. Standing at the bottom of her own front steps, Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she dialed her lawyer's number. The security lights had flickered on automatically, casting harsh shadows across Officer Thompson's increasingly agitated face. Her other hand clutched her designer handbag, which contained every document proving her ownership of the beautiful Victorian house behind her. "Listen carefully," her lawyer's voice crackled through the speaker. "Don't leave the property entirely. Stay on the sidewalk where the cameras can see everything." Sarah nodded, though her lawyer couldn't see her. The growing crowd of neighbors certainly could. Officer Thompson paced the porch like a caged animal, clearly uncomfortable with Sarah's calm defiance. His more experienced partner, Officer Martinez, had retreated to run the property records on their cruiser's computer. The third officer stood awkwardly between them, obviously unsure which approach to follow. "Ma'am, I won't tell you again," Thompson called out, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn. "You need to leave until we verify ownership." His hand still rested on his holster, a detail Sarah's security cameras captured perfectly. Sarah raised her voice just enough to be heard by the gathering observers. "Officer, I've shown you my driver's license with this exact address. I shown you my property deed. I shown you utility bills in my name. I'm standing here in business attire because I just returned from a conference in Chicago. Would you like to see my plane ticket too? Mrs. Henderson had finally emerged from her house, horror dawning on her face as she recognized Sarah. "Oh dear," the elderly woman gasped. "Officer, there's been a terrible mistake. That's Ms. Johnson. She owns that house. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I didn't recognize you in your suit when I reported someone suspicious." But Officer Thompson seemed to have dug his heels in too deep to back down now. His face flushed red as he pointed toward the street. "Ma'am, if you don't leave now, I'll have to place you under arrest for trespassing." The absurdity of being threatened with arrest for trespassing on her own property caused something to snap inside Sarah. She straightened her spine, years of boardroom negotiations healing her voice. "Officer Thompson, badge number 47,831. I want your supervisor here right now. I'm not moving from this sidewalk, my sidewalk, until they arrive." She turned to address the growing crowd of neighbors, her phone still recording everything. "Everyone watching, please keep your phones out. This is what's happening in our neighborhood on a Tuesday evening. A homeowner being denied access to their own property despite providing multiple forms of identification." The next few minutes would prove pivotal, not just for Sarah and Officer Thompson, but for the entire police department's future approach to property verification and community relations. Sometimes, the most powerful acts of resistance come not through violence or confrontation, but through an unwavering insistence on one's rights, documented for all to see. Sarah's lawyer, Marcus Chen, sat in his office late that evening, his computer screen illuminated by multiple windows showing crystal-clear security footage from Sarah's home. The footage played in perfect HD quality, capturing every moment of the confrontation. His assistant had already organized clips from all 4 security cameras, providing multiple angles of the incident. The main camera above the porch showed Officer Thompson's aggressive stance, his hand never leaving his holster while speaking to Sarah. The side camera captured the exact moment Sarah presented her identification and property documents, which Thompson barely glanced at before dismissing. The driveway camera recorded Mrs. Henderson's confession about the mistaken report and Thompson's continued refusal to acknowledge his error. Marcus leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. In 20 years of practicing law, he'd seen plenty of police misconduct cases, but rarely one so clearly documented. The timestamp on each video frame told a damning story. 8 minutes of sustained harassment despite clear evidence of property ownership. What particularly caught Marcus's attention was the footage showing Officer Martinez, Thompson's partner, returning from the patrol car. Her body language clearly showed she'd verified Sarah's ownership, yet Thompson had doubled down on his mistake. The audio picked up Martinez's attempted intervention. "Mike, I got confirmation here," before Thompson cut her off with a sharp gesture. The security system had also captured crystal-clear audio of every word exchanged. Thompson's threatening tone, his escalating demands, and most importantly, his complete disregard for proper procedure were all preserved in perfect digital quality. The camera even caught him mumbling under his breath, "These people always think they can live anywhere they want." Marcus began compiling the footage alongside Sarah's meticulously kept documentation. Property deed, utility bills, driver's license, and even her business ownership papers. Each document formed another brick in the wall of evidence proving not just her ownership, but the completely unnecessary escalation of the situation. As he prepared to send everything to the police department's Internal Affairs Division, Marcus noticed something else in the footage. Several neighbors had their phones out, recording the entire incident. By morning, this wouldn't just be a legal matter. It would be a public relations nightmare for the department. The evidence was overwhelming. But what made this case special wasn't just its documentation. It was how Sarah had handled herself, calm, professional, and assertive of her rights without escalation. In those critical 8 minutes, she'd managed to expose a systemic problem while maintaining her dignity and safety. The footage didn't show a victim. It showed a powerful woman standing her ground against injustice. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the police department's phones were ringing off the hook. Sarah's incident had gone viral overnight, with neighbors' cell phone footage spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. Marcus Chen walked confidently through the department's glass doors, carrying a thick folder under his arm and wearing his most expensive suit. The department's lobby was already buzzing with reporters, but Marcus bypassed them all, heading straight for the Internal Affairs Division. He'd scheduled an emergency meeting with Captain Diana Rodriguez, head of Internal Affairs, known throughout the city for her no-nonsense approach to police misconduct. Inside Rodriguez's office, Marcus laid out the evidence methodically. First, the security footage playing on his tablet, then the property documentation, and finally, the social media statistics showing how quickly the incident was spreading. Captain Rodriguez's face grew increasingly stern as she watched Officer Thompson's behavior unfold on screen. "This isn't just about one officer's misconduct," Marcus explained, his voice steady. "This is about systemic issues in property verification procedures. Ms. Johnson had every possible form of identification, yet was still threatened with arrest on her own property." Rodriguez nodded slowly, making notes. The partner, Officer Martinez, she tried to intervene. "Yes," Marcus confirmed, pulling up that specific clip. She had already verified Ms. Johnson's ownership through the department's database, but Officer Thompson ignored her. As they discussed the case, Sarah was conducting her own form of legal action. She'd arranged interviews with 3 major news networks, not to sensationalize the story, but to discuss the broader implications for property rights and police training. Her corporate background made her an articulate, compelling speaker, and her measured responses earned her widespread support. The department's legal team scrambled to respond as Marcus filed not just a complaint, but a comprehensive proposal for policy reform. Sarah wasn't interested in a quick settlement. She wanted lasting change. Her case was quickly becoming a rallying point for police reform advocates and property rights organizations alike. By afternoon, Officer Thompson's body camera footage had been pulled for review, providing yet another angle of his misconduct. The evidence was mounting, and with each passing hour, the department's need to take decisive action grew more urgent. Sarah's 8 minutes of patience were about to transform into a watershed moment for police accountability. The police department's press conference room was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters and community leaders. Chief David Morgan, a 30-year veteran of the force, stood at the podium looking every bit his age. The bags under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights spent dealing with this PR crisis that had exploded in just 48 hours. Effective immediately, Chief Morgan announced, his voice echoing through the microphones. "Officer Thompson has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." The room erupted with questions, camera flashes lighting up the chief's grim expression. Behind the scenes, the department was in chaos. Internal Affairs investigators worked overtime, interviewing every officer present at the scene. Officer Martinez's testimony proved particularly damning. She detailed how she tried 3 times to inform Thompson that she'd verified Sarah's ownership. The police union representatives sat in emergency meetings, knowing this case was indefensible. The security footage was too clear, the evidence too strong, and public opinion too unified. They couldn't risk their broader credibility by defending Thompson's actions. Sarah's case had triggered an unexpected avalanche of similar complaints. Other residents came forward with stories of being questioned about their presence in their own neighborhoods. The department's complaint hotline rang constantly, forcing them to bring in additional staff to handle the volume. Captain Rodriguez worked late into the night, reviewing years of similar incidents that had gone unreported. She discovered a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. Certain officers consistently failed to follow proper identification protocols, particularly in upscale neighborhoods with minority residents. The department's training division scrambled to develop new protocols. They'd reached out to civil rights organizations and property law experts, admitting they needed help to prevent future incidents. For the first time in years, The department seemed genuinely committed to meaningful change. Thompson himself sat in his apartment, watching his career crumble on national news. His 8 minutes of poor judgment had sparked a movement that would reshape police training across the country. Those 8 minutes were about to become a cautionary tale taught in police academies nationwide. The community center buzzed with energy as people filled every seat, with dozens more standing along the walls. Sarah stood at the front, no longer in her business suit but dressed casually, addressing a diverse crowd of homeowners, police officers, and community activists. 1 week had passed since her incident, but its ripples continued to spread. This isn't about one officer or one incident, Sarah's voice carried through the room. It's about building bridges between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Behind her, a projector displayed statistics about property verification incidents across the city, numbers that had remained hidden until now. Officer Martinez, who had tried to intervene during Sarah's incident, sat in the front row. She'd become an unexpected ally, working with Sarah to develop new training programs. Her presence sent a powerful message. Good officers wanted change too. The meeting wasn't just talk. Real solutions emerged as residents shared their experiences and officers contributed their perspectives. Local real estate agents discussed creating emergency property verification systems. Tech experts proposed apps that could safely store and display property documents. Civil rights lawyers offered free workshops on homeowner rights. Local news crews filmed as elderly Mrs. Henderson hugged Sarah, tears in her eyes as she publicly apologized again for her mistaken report. But Sarah turned this moment into a teaching opportunity, explaining how neighbors could look out for each other without letting bias cloud their judgment. The most powerful moment came when a young black couple stood up to share how they'd just bought their first home, but were afraid to move in. The room fell silent as they described their fears. Sarah immediately connected them with a network of supportive neighbors and legal resources she built over the past week. City council members who attended the meeting were visibly moved. By the end of the evening, they'd pledged to review and revise property verification policies across all city departments, not just law enforcement. Sarah's 8 minutes of standing her ground had sparked a movement that would protect countless future homeowners. 1 month later, Sarah stood in the police academy's main lecture hall, watching as a new batch of recruits studied her case. Her security footage had become mandatory viewing in police training nationwide. But today was special. Officer Thompson had asked to speak to the recruits himself. Thompson walked to the podium, noticeably thinner and more humble than the man in the security videos. "I lost my badge because of 8 minutes of ignorance," he began, his voice shaking. "But Ms. Johnson taught me more in those 8 minutes than my entire previous training." The department had completely overhauled its property verification procedures. Every officer now carried tablets with direct access to property records. More importantly, they'd implemented mandatory bias training and community engagement programs. Sarah's case had exposed the cracks in the system, but it also showed how to fix them. Sarah's front porch, once the scene of confrontation, had become a symbol of community unity. She hosted monthly neighborhood meetings where residents and police officers could discuss concerns openly. The garden where she used to work alone now had regular volunteers, including Officer Martinez, who'd become a close friend. Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor whose call started it all, had transformed into the neighborhood's most vigilant advocate for fairness. She organized a Know Your Neighbor program that brought together longtime residents and newcomers, breaking down the barriers of assumption and prejudice. The city council passed the Johnson Protocol, requiring all emergency responders to follow strict verification procedures before taking action at private residences. Other cities began adopting similar measures, with Sarah traveling to speak about her experience and the positive changes it sparked. As Sarah concluded the training session, a young recruit raised her hand. "Weren't you afraid during those 8 minutes?" she asked. Sarah smiled, remembering the mix of fear and determination she'd felt that evening. "I was," she admitted, "but I knew that standing my ground wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who'd come after me." Sometimes, 8 minutes is all it takes to start a revolution of understanding.